thank you everyone for having me and being here for my talk. My name is Dongwoo Hahm. I'm a postdoc at USC, and I'll be talking about my paper, A Dynamic Framework of School Choice, joint with Minseon, my friend and co-author who will be on the market this year. Right. So as given the audience, everybody probably knows what the school choice is about. School choice is a tool of assigning students to schools based on and respecting their choices. And many jurisdictions around the world have implemented what we call the market design-based school choice at various levels of education. In a very similar picture as just Irene showed us, usually a centralized market design-based school choice works through a mechanism which takes two main inputs. First, the students' applications to schools, and second, how schools select the students, and produces an assignment for each student. Our main motivation is the sequential nature of the school choice. The fact that students face school choices multiple times throughout the education implies that these choices are closely related to each other. However, this has been neglected by both the scholars and also the policymakers. First, no existing studies have actually examined the sequential nature of school choices directly. And instead, they focused on analyzing a given school choice stage in isolation with other stages. And as a result, we don't have a good empirical evidence as well as a right framework to study the sequential nature of school choice. And second, the sequential nature of school choice has also been neglected by the policymakers when they talk about segregation across schools, which is a very important problem in large urban school districts, as Irene also has just shown us. And usually, the admission reforms to tackle segregation have targeted each level of education separately without considering how intervening at one stage might affect other stages and vice versa. And let's talk about that in the context of racial segregation across high schools. Segregation patterns may actually develop much earlier than high schools. And for example, if middle schools are already segregated, this could lead to more segregation in high schools. But any kind of a high school only policy will fail to address this type of issue. So the research questions we ask in this paper are two things. First, does a student's previous school choice affect the subsequent choices of the students? And second, how can we use this relationship to address segregation across schools? By answering these questions, we aim to develop a novel and evidence-based dynamic model of school choices. And second, provide a new insight into how we should understand and address segregation accordingly. The context we'll be studying is the New York City public middle and high school choices. And to do so, we make use of the student-level application data acquired from the Department of Education of New York City, focusing on the cohort that applied to middle schools in 2014 to 15, and then to high schools 3 years later. The New York City uses the deferred acceptance algorithm, and it's worth to mention about what's the priority rules are used in, which priority rules are used in New York City. They are pre-specified, pre-announced, and consist of two layers. First, each school divides their applicants into a few number of groups, for example, students in Manhattan, and second to students who attend an information session, for example. And whenever there is a tie among students, they use a lottery to break ties. So what we do in this paper, we first start by providing an empirical evidence of middle school's effects on high school applications and assignments of the students. We make use of the randomness in the middle school assignments generated by the tie-breaking rules, as I just talked about in the previous slide. Next, based on this evidence, we developed and estimate a novel dynamic model of school choice. And to do so, we make use of the dynamic discrete choice model, combine that with large market matching theory to model the dynamics of the school choices. And using the model, we also decompose the middle school's effects on the high school assignments into two channels. First, how middle schools can affect how students rank high school applications. And second, how high schools rank students can also change by the middle school, by attending different middle schools. And in the last part of the paper, we perform a counterfactual analysis studying concurrent admissions reform in New York City. More specifically, we study the effects of admissions reform on segregation when such reforms are implemented at different timings. And now let me give you the preview of the findings. First, we find that the middle school students attended do impact the students' taste on high schools that underlie their high school applications. First, attending middle schools of higher quality makes students value the quality high schools even more. And also, attending middle schools with many of the same race students makes students want to be with more same race students in high schools. Second, these taste changes have an actual impact on the student's high school assignment by affecting how students apply to high schools. By the decomposition exercise, we find that the impact of middle schools on high school assignments mainly operates by affecting the set of high school that students apply to. So these first two findings have both bad news and good news about segregation. First, the bad news is that segregation has a reinforcing effect. If middle schools are already segregated, it'll change students' taste on high schools toward more segregation, and that taste change will impact the high school assignments, in turn affecting high school segregation. However, the good news is that since middle schools and high school choices are so closely related, we might be able to intervene at the middle school level to address segregation in high schools. And that is what we quantify in the last part of the paper. By the counterfactual analysis, we find that the middle school only admissions reform can desegregate first the middle school, obviously, but second, more importantly, also the high schools. And the policy implication and the takeaway is that an early intervention in the form of middle school admissions reform can be useful for desegregation. And the dynamic relationship of the school choices can be used to design better policy. Right. For the interest of time, let me directly dive into the main part of the paper. In the first part of the paper, we provide evidence of middle school's causal effects on high school choice and outcomes. Specifically, we estimate the treatment effects of attending some types of middle schools on what kind of high schools they apply to and what kind of high schools they are assigned to. Throughout the paper, we're going to use two groups of schools. And the first one is what we call the high achievement schools, which is defined by the top third in terms of the average test scores of the students. Second is what we call the high minority schools, defined similarly, but in the proportion of Black or Hispanic students. But here, the treatment variable, attending some middle school, is a result of students' middle school choice, and hence there's going to be a selection bias. And to overcome this, we used a quasi-experimental feature built in the centralized assignment mechanism. And to do that, we used the framework of Abdulkadiroglu, Hengris, Narita, and Pathak, which uses the tie-breaking rule I mentioned in the introduction. So what we find? First, we find that the middle schools the students attend impact the students' applications to high schools. We find that attending a high achievement middle schools makes students apply to high schools of higher quality. And second, the first finding was about the applications. And second, when we look into the assignment to high schools, we actually find that the treatment effects are larger in magnitude. We interpret this as the treated students, the students who attended high achievement middle school, not only apply to high schools of higher quality, but those higher quality high schools also view these high achievement middle school students more favorably. And this possibility is going to be built in our structural model, which will come next slide. Okay. So here, I'm not going to give you all the equations. In fact, I'm not going to show you any Greek letter, but rather explain my model in graphical way. The model is a two-period model, where the first period corresponds to the middle school choice, and the second period corresponds to the high school choice. Since it's a finite horizon model, I'm going to start from the second period. And in the second period, the high school assignment is determined by students' applications to schools, the rank order list, and how school selects the students. We assume schools are passive players because how they select the students, the rules are pre-announced and pre-specified. But for the students, we assume students have utility over the high school characteristics that underlie their applications to high schools. As a function of their own demographics, distance to each school, and some unobservable taste, and most importantly, the middle schools they attended. And in the first period, the structure of the model is almost identical. Now, let me explain how we model the middle school's effect on the high school choice. The first one is what we call the student application channel. Namely, the middle school the student attends can affect the student's utilities on high schools that underlie their high school applications. And this could happen through two sub-channels, let's say. The first one is through the change in their own demographics, namely the test scores. We know from the past literature that if student herself is a high performer, her valuation on the quality of the high school is larger. And also, by attending different middle schools with different value added, students will have different end of middle school test scores, which would impact their applications to high school through this channel. Second, on top of the test scores, there might be something more happening by the middle schools. For example, by attending different middle schools, I may have different peers or friends, which would impact my high school application. Or second, different middle schools might have different counselors, for example, that are able to provide better or worse information about high schools when they apply to high schools. We don't have enough data to disentangle all those possibilities, but instead, we directly allow the middle school to enter the utility function of the high school, on the high schools, in a way that depending on the middle school student attend, their taste on the high school characteristics can be different. Next. That was about the application channel. And the second one is what we call the priority channel. Namely, the middle schools, depending on the middle schools they attend, they may have different priorities at each high school, impacting their admission probabilities at high schools. First, again, by attending different middle schools, students may have different test scores, and this may impact their admission probabilities at high schools, which use test scores for admissions. And second, the middle school the students attend can also change their priority groups at high schools. For example, the most commonly used priority group rule is what we call the geographic priority rule. And say I'm a high school in Manhattan, then I can give a priority to Manhattan students. So if a student living in Brooklyn just cross the bridge and attend the middle school in Manhattan, the student can obtain some priority at this Manhattan high school. And this is going to be allowed in our model. Next, we allow the unobservable taste in each period to be serially correlated. And this generates the source of sorting based on the unobservables, and we explicitly model that. Finally, we assume that students are forward-looking in the sense that when they apply to middle schools, they take these potential effects on their eventual high school assignment into consideration. Okay? How we estimate the model. The key concept that is going to be used for our estimation is ex post stability. Namely, we assume that in each period, the students' rank order list, the applications, are such that the resulting assignment outcome is ex post stable. What ex-post stability means is that each student is assigned to the most preferred school among the set of schools where she clears the ex-post cutoffs. In other words, feasible as used in the literature. And by assuming ex-post stability, we are basically abstracting away from knowing the exact strategies employed by the students, because ex-post stability concept is about outcomes, not about the student strategies. And ex-post stability is not only consistent with the truth-telling assumption that has been traditionally used in the literature, but also with more robust assumptions as documented in more recent literature. We use MLE to estimate the model and focus on the students and residents of Staten Island for tractability. Now let me show you the main finding. We find that first, the middle school students attend do impact their taste on the high school characteristics. In terms of the taste on the academic performance of the schools, attending high achievement middle schools makes students value the quality of the high schools even more, measured by the proportion of the high performers. And second, also, the middle schools affect their taste on racial composition. We find that the students who attended high minority middle schools with lots of minority students actually want to be less with white students in high school. And these two together implies that segregation has a reinforcing effect, both in terms of academic segregation and also racial segregation. Second finding is that we find that the application channel, the change through the student's high school application, is quantitatively more important than the priority channel in the middle school's effects on the high school choice outcomes. By the decomposition exercise, we find that nearly 2/3 of the middle school's effects on the quality of the high school assignment can be explained by the change in the student's applications. Now, the final part of the paper, we do a counterfactual analysis. Just to give you a little bit of background, New York City public schools are extremely racially segregated. And this has been long acknowledged by the Department of Education. And they, 2 years ago, announced two policies to desegregate schools. First, to eliminate the geography-based priority rules, which prioritize students who live nearby each school. And second, to eliminate selecting students based on their test scores. We basically combine these two policies and compare its effect when the policy is implemented at alternative timing. We consider 3 timings. First, we reform only the middle schools. Second, we reform only the high schools. And third, we reform both middle and high school admissions. And here's the finding of our counterfactual analysis. First of all, a middle school only admissions reform can desegregate middle schools. Not surprising. But on top of that, through the middle school's effects on high school choice that we have documented in this paper, we find that the middle school only admissions reform can also desegregate high schools. And also, combining the middle and high school admissions reform is more effective in desegregating high schools than the high school only admissions. Okay, so I'm running out of time, so let me give you the policy implication and conclude. In a school choice context, the student's assignments is determined both by the demand, the student's application, and supply, how schools select the students. And most existing desegregation policies have focused on reforming the supply side by imposing a new priority rule, zone school, and so on and so forth. What we suggest in this paper is that middle school and high school choices are closely dynamically related, and this dynamic relationship can be used and should be used by the policymakers to design more effective policies. Because we found that an early intervention on the supply side, the middle school admissions reform, can alter the subsequent demand side behavior of the students. Let me stop here, and for any comments or suggestions, questions, please send me an email and I'll be happy to discuss. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any question on Gather, Irene. If you have time for quick, short, flash questions from the room. Otherwise, we should proceed to the next.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. It was a very interesting talk. I was wondering if you can just tell us what you did with non-compliers, people basically that get their assignment and opt out, because I can imagine stories where your results are mostly driven by those guys.
Right. So that's interesting. All right. Yeah. First of all, the sample we use are students who applied to middle schools and then to high schools too. So those who didn't opt out after getting their middle school admissions. But to talk about the potential issues that you mentioned, we also estimated the treatment effects on the opt-out behavior of the students using the full sample. And what we find is that there's no treatment effect on the opt-out behavior. So we don't believe that the opting out behavior will be a problem to interpreting. Did that answer your question?
Great, thank you. Let's select the speaker again.